Where's the regular yeah, so don't look for a long or that works. And this is great. Well, anything else you need to do before we start? Yeah. Like I said, by February, March, I wear string.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to everyone in the room and everybody watching online. I'm Genevieve Melford, Program Director of EPIC and Director of Insights and Evidence with the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. Today's event is being live streamed and will be live tweeting from @AspenFSP if you want to follow along with that. And we do encourage everyone to join the conversation and to submit questions throughout the event with the hashtag AspenEpic. And we also ask people here in the room to please silence their phones. So that's it for housekeeping, nice and quick. And I'm so pleased to have such a diverse and powerful set of stakeholders here with us today, in person and online, for the release of our Consumer Debt Solutions Framework. My job today is going to be kind of to set the stage for what we've learned about consumer debt and sort of set the kind of table for what you'll be hearing from these great panels who are here with us today as well. So none of this work that we've done on consumer debt would be possible without the incredible work of the whole financial security program team, the brilliant and generous experts who work with us to inform the EPIC process. EPIC would not happen without them, and our core EPIC funders, to whom we extend our warmest thanks. The Annie E. Casey Foundation, JP Morgan Chase and Company, MetLife Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. So this event today is a culmination of 18 months of work of our EPIC process. For those of you who don't know, the Expanding Prosperity Impact Collaborative, or EPIC for short, is a first-of-its-kind initiative in the field of consumer finance. It's designed to harness the knowledge of a wide cross-section of experts, those experts I already mentioned and thanked today, working in applied academic, government, and industry settings to generate deeply informed analyses of one issue at a time, and to forge consensus and broad support to implement solutions. And that's really what we're here about today. The first issue we investigated through this process was income volatility. And 18 months ago, we turned to consumer debt. The two criteria we use to choose an EPIC issue are that it represents a deeply consequential challenge to the financial security of millions of American households, and that it is not yet fully understood. Consumer debt meets both criteria. First of all, consumer debt in the United States has reached record levels and is a reality for most Americans. Since World War II, every generation of Americans has carried more consumer debt than the generation before. 77% of Americans today have at least some debt. And the current total non-mortgage debt held by American households exceeds $3.8 trillion. So this is a large market we're talking about. Consumer debt includes student and auto loans and money owed on credit cards, but not all debt is the result of borrowing. Out-of-pocket medical expenses, government-imposed fines and fees, and unpaid bills also add to consumer debt burdens. And one indication that these debts are not sustainable for many people is that debt in collections appear on fully 1/3 of consumer credit reports. The holistic picture of consumer debt in the United States has not been fully understood. Consumer debt is a complicated issue. One of the challenges to finding effective solutions is that most experts tend to study just one category of debt. So through the EPIC process, we've chosen to look at debt from the consumer perspective rather than any particular debt type, and explore the aspects of debt most harmful to households and the country, their causes and consequences, and the types of solutions that can make a difference. Our work on consumer debt has involved learning from experts, representing a wide variety of sectors and industries, synthesizing existing research, and hearing directly from consumers struggling with debt. And what we have learned after these 18 months of work, and this is the core message running through our whole event today, is that the problems of consumer debt are systemic, they're consequential, and they are solvable. So over the next couple of minutes, I will address each of these issues in turn. First, this debt reflects systemic issues decades in the making. As most of you know, the story of the American economy since at least the 1970s is the story of a shift from manufacturing to knowledge and services. This means that good jobs increasingly require a college degree. But at the same time that a college degree has become increasingly necessary, the cost of college has outstripped the consumer price index by more than 500%. As a result, 70% of today's college students cannot enroll without borrowing. The average debt upon graduation for a member of the class of 2017 exceeds $39,000. Stagnating incomes and thin margins are another major driver of consumer debt. Too many households simply do not have sufficient income to meet basic needs and provide a cushion for the unexpected. Such households have to borrow to smooth consumption, often on terms that trap them in a debt cycle from which it can be very difficult to break free, or simply cannot afford the basics. 1/3 of all delinquent debt is from unpaid bills. Meanwhile, while the Affordable Care Act has provided some relief from medical costs to some households, others are struggling with both increased medical premiums and increased out-of-pocket expenses. 20% of consumers, 1 in 5, have a medical collections trade line on their credit report, and more than half of those with medical debt have otherwise clean credit histories. Finally, state and municipal governments increasingly rely on fees and fines to make up for revenue shortfalls. Those fees and fines disproportionately affect low-income households already struggling with debt. And the unique power of the state to impose escalating penalties can cause government-imposed debts to snowball quickly to crisis proportions for vulnerable households. And as you will hear much more about from our next panel of community leaders, all this debt is consequential. It has impacts at every level: individual, family, community, and for the nation as a whole. Individual debtors face a range of possible responses from creditors that can make a bad situation worse. Loss of income from wage garnishments, loss of necessary transportation to earn income from repossessed cars, higher interest rates, penalties and late fees, loss of driving privileges, or even jail. And people who struggle with debt have worse physical health and are more than twice as likely to suffer from depression and anxiety disorders. This is serious. Debt is a really, really big problem for people. Impacts on families include that debt-stressed people tend to postpone marrying and starting families. And if already living in a family, debt-stressed parents have less time and energy for their children. At the community level, debt-stressed people have a harder time engaging in civic life. A community of stressed out, socially isolated people is not healthy. And at the national level, most student loans are guaranteed by the federal government. Already 11% are in default. And consumer debt imposes real costs to the economy. In the present, such as higher healthcare costs for the higher rates of illness debt-stressed people suffer. In the future, when lower levels of retirement savings among the debt-stressed will mean more public assistance requirements, and in opportunity costs through lower worker productivity and lower levels of the consumer spending that's a major driver of the economy. But the good news is that the consumer debt crisis is also solvable. Today, we are releasing a framework for holistically solving consumer debt problems from many angles. The report outlines 7 specific consumer debt problems that are a source of financial insecurity for millions of people and lays out a menu of actions that leaders in all sectors can take to lift the weight of consumer debt from families, communities, and future generations of Americans. Following the panel of community leaders that you'll hear from next, my colleague Catherine Lucas McKay will present the solutions framework, and then we'll hear from an inspiring panel of public and private sector innovators who are leading the way on solutions to several different aspects of consumer debt problems, so showing us that it can be done. So thank you all for joining us today to learn more about the ways in which the consumer debt crisis in America is systemic, consequential, and with committed leadership, of which there already is a lot, solvable. So please join me with that in welcoming Ida Rademacher, Executive Director of the Financial Security Program, who will introduce our first panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Everybody just come on up here. All right, and get a seat. Good morning.
Really?
Good morning, and everybody online. Thanks for joining us this morning as well.
That's good.
Do I have an echo? Is this okay, people? All right. Give a hand here. All right, great. Thank you, Salia. Awesome. Okay, so Genevieve was very comprehensive, but also modest in her work. We've been thrilled to have her join the team and help to give even more structure and deep thinking to how to design solution frameworks. And so the whole EPIC team has been, really engaged with hundreds and hundreds of people over the last year to get, I think, a pretty unique understanding of a holistic sense of consumer debt, and also really being able to figure out some places we're going to go into deeply today about where to solve this problem in meaningful ways for households. And before we get there, I have the privilege today of sitting in for Joanna Smith-Romani, who is the managing director for Aspen FSP, who is sick. So hi, Joe, I know you're watching today. To join this incredible panel. And part of what our goal is right now is before we tee up the solutions that we know are going to make a difference in the lives of millions of Americans, we want to ground the problems that Genevieve was talking about back in real communities and in real lives. And the panel of experts that I have here today, I just thank you for coming. And let me just introduce who they are. And I'm going to you've got full bios, both online and in front of you. So I would just say, I'll start right here. Daniel Bose is a senior attorney for the North Carolina Justice Center. Thanks for being here. Yep. And Sue Berkowitz, to Daniel's next over, is the director of South Carolina Appleseed. Thanks for joining us. Thank you. And then Rosalia Grillier. How did I do that? Is that all right? Okay, that was great. Is the president, co-president of Kofi Power Pack Illinois. And thank you again for being here as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody has got extraordinary stories in your communities about the work you're doing. And so I think to get going here, I'm interested in the personal connection. Each of you has a multifaceted organization that you work with and for, grounded in community. And the issue of consumer debt came onto your radar screen. How and why? I'd like a little bit of a kind of why did you and your organization decide that this was an issue both necessary to work on and to prioritize? And if there's a specific flavor to that, that's your own personal aha moment, I'd love to hear that too. Would you like to start?
Sure.
Daniel? Okay.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and glad to be on the panel with y'all. So I come to this from the criminal justice perspective, and so I grew up as a child of an incarcerated father and a justice-involved mom, and so at a very early age saw them experience what a lot of people experience, try to leave the criminal justice system and strive for a better life and run up against all these unnecessary barriers to employment, to housing, to a stable financial situation. And so I saw that at a very early age. Somebody with the best intentions can be put into an impossible circumstance and usually would result in a bad outcome for everybody. And so, have worked with a coalition of directly impacted people, service providers in North Carolina called the North Carolina Second Chance Alliance for the last, they've been around for the last 10 years. I've been working with them for the past 7 years to really try to reduce a lot of these barriers. And so one of the primary barriers we see are something called legal financial obligations. And it's become much more of an issue in the past 10, 20 years as the court fees that people experience, court fees that are attached to criminal judgments, have increased dramatically. And also the legislatures or municipalities, it depends on the circumstance, have become more dependent on these revenues. And so really trying to in a situation that really hurts individuals and again puts them into an impossible situation where they can't pay off these fees and end up having their probation extended or revoked and going back to prison, or a lot of what I focus on is in the driver's license context where somebody doesn't pay $300 for a traffic ticket for an expired registration that was probably related to poverty in the first place and can't pay that in 100 days and automatically and indefinitely loses their license, which I think the thing here is that everybody knows how important a license is, especially in states and where it's rural. Some cities have bus lines and public transportation, but a lot don't, and so it really puts them into a really bad situation. And so it's about sort of working with legislators and working with district attorneys even to address those unnecessary barriers.
Mm-hmm. And my guess, and we'll go on through this, but my own sense of that is that any individual that this happens to tends to look at it as a personal hurdle, and you've been able to look at it and go, wow, there's actually, this is that systemic level, that there's actually a percentage of people for whom this is a significant thing, but from any individual standpoint, they might not have ever seen that as something that is a broader issue for more than themselves.
Exactly. I mean, I think there's some sense of unfairness immediately, but when you see that you get a traffic ticket and it's a $10 fine and $250 in court costs, something immediately strikes people as being off there. But generally, yes, like it does, because it is the state imposing this, it has an air of legitimacy to it that it shouldn't have. And so I do think that it more than other places, well, really with a lot of consumer issues, is attached to some sort of personal failure, which is really not the case, and it really is a systemic issue.
Yeah, thanks. Sue, what's your own kind of why I decided this is part of my ongoing crusade?
Well, when I started at Legal Aid, I had no idea what a consumer practice was, and I immediately started, and I began to see, because we're a deregulated state in South Carolina, people who would come into our office with loans that were 80, 90, 150% interest, and this was back in the mid-'80s, and I would take, we'd work with the client, we'd get them out of that particular loan, and if the same client didn't come back in, we would see somebody who was equally taken advantage of, because the systems that were in place for lending for the communities that we were representing, which were very low-income communities and primarily communities of color, the opportunities for borrowing at any kind of regular or prime rate was absolutely non-existent. So what ended up happening is the reason for borrowing, which may have been something as simple as, like, when you're in a rural state, you need to buy a new tire, or you can't afford your power bill, or your child needs some kind of school fee that might be being charged so they can go on a field trip, things that many people just take for granted. Of course, I'll just take care of. That person ends up going to what we know of as a high-cost lender. And I recognize that there's only so many Band-Aids I could put on the solution, that we really needed to be dealing with this on a policy and legislative level. And in my position when I moved over to Appleseed back in the late 80s, decided that this is how we were going to be addressing it. Problem is as we started to address the small lending industry, other industries found this to be quite lucrative, and we started seeing industries like payday lending, auto title lending. There were a whole list of new opportunists who were coming in who wanted to strip the money out of low-income communities. And for payday lenders, at one point, we were seeing over $150 million in fees and fines being taken out of primarily the low-income communities of color in South Carolina, and being shipped out of state. And what we knew is this was big business, because making money off of poor people is always big business. And we were attempting to try to tamp that down and find ways to regulate Unfortunately, we're in a state where the payday lending industry while we've been able to tamp it down some, still is very, very lucrative because it has one of the largest lenders in the country located in our state. But we know that when you're taking now only $50 million from one industry out of the community, what that is doing is taking wealth out of the community and keeping people in that cycle of poverty and cycle of debt that then impacts as folks go along. And you don't find someone with just one payday loan. You find someone with payday loan, number of consumer finance loans, auto title loans, and all of those lead to poverty just being perpetuated and folks not able to get out of that cycle.
Yeah, that's what I was going to probe on a little bit, because it sounds like, again, maybe this narrative once again shows up where people feel individual responsibility. They want to pay their bills or address their issues, and that you found that these usually don't occur with one loan. That when you end up meeting somebody, like what's a typical person who you end up engaging with, what are they facing?
Well, the first thing that is very typical when I'm talking to someone who's facing this is the first thing they do is apologize to me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen. And I have to actually say to the individual, you didn't do anything. Because of your circumstances, you got taken advantage of. There's responsibility on the other side for the way they're lending and how they're lending, and this was done with a real design. And so an example would be a woman who'd come to our office not too long ago, Ida, who is a veteran on VA disability, also a small amount of Social Security. She got behind on some bills, went to an auto title lender, borrowed money from the auto title lender. The interest rate was, I believe, just under 300%. She was paying, and at 300%, when you're borrowing even $1,500, that can end up being a $400 or $500 a month bill on top of everything else that you're trying to pay. And she ended up refinancing that or flipping that a couple times, and she thought she had done the right thing by going to a responsible lender, One Main, where they gave her a 32% interest rate, which to her was a whole lot better than 280%, but she still ended up with a payment, while more manageable in her finances, was going to keep her indebted. I often call folks that these lenders go to the gift that keeps on giving, because they know eventually you're going to have to refinance. They don't want you to only borrow one time. They want you to keep refinancing, because thinking about whether it's a payday lender or an auto title lender, if you get $82.50 every time someone flips you in a payday loan, that's great, $82.50 on the first loan, but when it's been going on 10, 12 times, that's when you're really making money. And we have to remember that's money being taken out of the community and sent elsewhere.
No, thanks for putting an additional layer on that. Rosalia, it's a perfect place to bring you in, because the work that you're doing relates to both kinds, the families that you work with, right, and the way that debt presents in their lives. Maybe you could say a little bit more about why that's something that's gotten you even more organized than I thought was humanly possible in terms of what you're doing in your community around these issues.
So good morning, everyone. And absolutely everything these guys said. I really, so far this morning, our song has really been choirized by every voice this morning, because it's absolutely what you said. Absolutely what you said. Absolutely what you said. But what brought me to this work is I'm that person, actually. And so many others in our organization, in the communities. We started off citywide, in the communities that we've trained parents in so-called low-income communities. I like to say challenged communities. That were experiencing these very same things. We've got 5 different campaigns, and one of our campaigns, which is this one, is called Stepping Out of Poverty, because overwhelmingly across the city of Chicago, we discovered that these things were happening in communities of color predominantly. And not only were they happening, they were being predicated upon, they were targets for these very same things. And so we started to do some research along with other partners like Loyola Curl to really see whether or not it was true. Our partners like Woodstock even took some of it a little bit further to get some specific numbers. And you guys can look on our website and find all of this detailed information. So I won't bore you with numbers today. But I will say, not only from my experience, but now we've proven and found out across Chicago, across all of Illinois, these kinds of predications are happening. People are being put in debt to some very, very scary outcomes and consequences. I heard you mention earlier, it's causing depression, which leads to what? Suicide. All because I had debt. How many people don't have some form of debt? Are there any debt-free people in here?
One hand in the room, just so you know. I'm not sure.
I need to speak with you after this. And people want to pay their debt. And that feeling of how did I get here? But the predication absolutely makes it impossible. And this is what is happening. And I want to go so far as to say across the country, because I'm also a part of a national initiative called U-Plan, but we won't go there right now. Let's just stick with Chicago and Illinois. And absolutely, it is causing suicide at an alarming rate. It's causing homelessness at an alarming rate. It's causing so many negative, detrimental impacts to families who just want to raise their families and have the American dream like any other person. But yet I chose you to not only make sure that you stay poor, but to make sure that for generations to come, you will never be anything other than poor. But we say not so. And I'm not going to go into all of our solutions because Ann is here and amazing for this next session, and I can't wait. But because of these things, we did the research to go and prove it. Parents took it to the street. We knocked on doors. We did surveys. We went in all the places all across Illinois to prove the kinds of debt that were taking place and the impact of that debt.
Well, let's go there a little bit more. So I think that's interesting in and of itself. Mm-hmm. That one, it's a design of your organization, but the parents themselves realizing that debt was consequential in their communities. Could you say a little bit more about when we at Epic, we thought the value add of spending 18 months on debt wasn't because there's an amazing work being done on student debt and there's amazing work being done on fines and fees and amazing work being done on predatory and high-cost consumer lending, but that how that actually joins up and sits heavy on a household. And what does it do? So could you say a little bit from one of your families or from your, any experience there about
and
how
that's
that fits?
That's an excellent point because someone else is always trying to tell our story and they usually get it wrong. And so this was why it was imperative for parents to share their own stories, but also in a relatable sense because there's a lot of fear for people to share and open up, especially around financial issues, because you could open your mouth and lose the very dollar that keeps you sustainable for the month, so you don't have to quite borrow 1,000. You could just borrow like 900. And so in the sense of that fear, parents want to do it themselves. And boy, did we hear some horror stories. A couple of them that come to mind. Outside of my own, I have like 5 or 10 of my own, so I won't even go into mine today. And they probably touch on everything that has been talked about today, including the medical debt. So while I was dying from cancer, severe aortic stenosis, there was still the accumulation not only of medical bills, but the other predatory things that were happening behind the scenes that you can't even die in peace in some of our communities because there's always somebody taking advantage of that system. But I think about Rosalva, and this has a lot of missing pieces because we're looking at a financial justice framework, which doesn't take one of these pieces. We're looking at everything that is predicated upon in our communities that keeps folks from building assets. But Rosalva was in a domestic violence situation. Her husband was severely abusive to her. And in her effort to get out of that situation, rebuild her lives with her children, she was being predicated upon again as if she wasn't victimized enough with the very debt that he created, building up tickets and fines and fees
in her name.
with the car, right, with the car that she helped pay for but didn't have any entitlement to until they wanted to collect this money, and then she became responsible, being victimized again. And so with good faith, as you alluded to, she wanted to take care of this and move on. She scraps up borrowed Peter, Paul, John, all of the apostles. She got money from them, and she went to try and take them $500 to what I think was like a $2,500 bill. I don't remember the exact numbers, but she came with a portion and said, hey, help me set up a payment plan. Let me get started with working on this, and I'll give you what I can wherever I can. Not so. Because this predatory system knows she can't pay it all at once, and they could continue to tack on fees. They said, no, unless you bring us $1,500, you can't even start a payment plan. So there's no recourse. There's no ability to pay the debt that you owe. And that is predication. Furthermore, it's inhuman because you're re-victimizing her again. I'll take Donna, who just wants to live, has her children, they're in a home, already impoverished, already struggling just to pay the bills every month, and never actually accomplishing that. And so they turn off her cooking ability. The children are in the cold. She's trying to pay. There are all these new systems that you have to pay a certain way. They won't take a down payment. And it just gets to be ridiculous. And I could go on and on with story after story.
Let's put it back in the round, because I think in many ways my job here becomes pretty superfluous quickly, because the three of you have a lot that you could actually jump in on for one another. So let me let us go there first and just say, Daniel, you've been quietly waiting on. You've been listening as well. And so are there additional dimensions of what you're seeing in North Carolina or what you're hearing from for both Rosalia and from Sue that you want to comment on now?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll start with the importance of facilitating impacted people sharing their own story. That's sort of a prime goal of the North Carolina Second Chance Alliance. And so we actually had we host roundtables and have tried to pursue district attorneys as partners in this and sort of in our solution around criminal justice debt, especially driver's license. But we had a woman come to a listening session with the district attorney in Wake County, Raleigh, North Carolina, and share her story. And basically what she said was that she had been charged with a drug crime. She'd never had any offense before. She was a manager of a gas station, was charged with a high-level drug crime, and given a bail that she could not afford. So she went, but she wanted to profess her innocence, and so she took her case to trial. So she spent 300 days in pretrial confinement. And for each one of those days was charged $10, so that's $3,000 right there.
Plus lost income?
Plus lost income. And then was at trial was actually acquitted of her most serious crime and convicted of a low-level felony and put on probation, and so released that day. But in North Carolina, and in like a lot of states, when you have probation, that's $40 per. That's some sort of fee. In North Carolina, it's $40 per month to be on probation. She was ordered to do community service, which in order to do community service, you have to pay $250, and it just sort of added up. And so she was coming to the district attorney saying, "I owe thousands and thousands of dollars in fee, which I'm required to pay as a term of my probation." And so I've been taken out of my community for 300 days, as you said, had no income. I'm coming back with the scarlet letter that is a felony conviction in order to immediately pay. And if I don't, then I am going to prison. And so was talking about what a lot of people feel like, which is they're being set up to fail. And basically fueling a revolving door criminal justice system.
And she was fully employed before this, going to work, doing her job.
Yeah, and she was, I mean, basically breaking down and crying in front of the district attorney. And to her credit, Lauren Freeman, the district attorney, acknowledged that that is not a good outcome for the criminal justice system, and said that when you have sort of the assembly line that the criminal justice becomes, the criminal justice system is in a lot of places, especially in traffic court, but that an assistant district attorney is not always thinking sort of how all these things add up when they order somebody to do community service, when they don't ask the judge to waive these fees, and so to their and said that she would try to do better at that. But also, what we're trying to do in North Carolina is have the district attorneys sort of understanding what is the best outcome for the community and for the criminal justice system, be the leaders on this and actually bring it to the court's attention and ask these fees to be waived. Now, the problem with that is the legislature has put up a lot of procedural and political barriers to judges using their broad discretion to waive fees.
Right.
And
You're
so,
saying, we were talking earlier, you were saying, and this is, I want to know if this is more widespread as well. I'm guessing, again, on our systemic, we're hitting the consequential pretty heavy, which I think is, so important. And the systemic part would be, it sounds like in North Carolina, there's actual limitations on the discretionary ability of judges to address these issues in a way that, if they might have more context. Is that happening in other parts of the country as well?
definitely. Well, and
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it absolutely is. And it's really a ripple effect. You could start out simply poor and you could end up with years of jail time. Because each thing takes you to another. The impact of it, as she alluded to in the opening, each thing takes you to another. Because if you're trying to feed your family, I've had countless fathers who had good jobs and were going to work and were trying to take care of their families, as people often paint a picture that they don't. And just one violation or too many tickets or something that got you into the criminal system, then whirlwind into making you a criminal who actually has never created a crime, but you've been guilty of being poor. And in that same frame, or people who have been pushed out of jobs in any way to survive until they actually become criminals. Good people actually, in order just to feed their families, end up having to go in a grocery store and steal a chicken. I mean, just the impact of these things is happening across the country, but I know firsthand in Illinois
And
it
Sue,
is.
you're nodding with all of
Yeah,
this.
and I mean, I think the real systemic point of this is that in many states, this is a way that the state supports itself. Instead of thinking of, just like predatory lenders support themselves on the backs of low-income people, the state is also doing that by having fees and fines as a primary way to be able to finance all of the municipalities, for the court system. And so when you talk about, well, we need to be reducing all of these debts, well, we need to make it affordable, we don't need to help someone get into the cycle so that they can't get out of it, well, then what you're talking about is, well, the court system says, well, if I don't get my fees, how am I going to be able to move forward? The district attorney or the solicitor's office is, every time somebody is in any kind of supervised program, well, then they're getting their fees, and that's how they're paying for their services. And when you go to the legislature and you talk to them about a common sense way to fund the services of our state, many of our states have gone from a common sense tax system, because we don't like to talk about common sense tax systems, to looking at how are we going to use these fees and fines to support our states. And then that's often on the backs of the people who can least afford it. That causes them to lose their jobs, lose their vehicles, not be able to support their families, and it just perpetuates a very poor system. So the systems changes themselves have to be the states in thinking about, are we being logical in the way we're looking at funding ourselves?
I think it's so it's been interesting, the way that EPIC works. We spend a lot of time seeing what's been published by across the board, and we bring a lot of people together, and we've spent time in smaller rooms off the record with all of you all, and many in the room and in our advisory board and our communities around the country. Part of where we'll go with the solution framework is really understanding what we ended up with, this kind of like front end, back end lingo. We're talking about, what's the front end of incurring debt? What are the reasons that households end up in a debt situation? And that's really many times the end of the story, right? About kind of what's happened, and what we've understood from what you all are saying, focusing on the non-loan debt. I mean, there's loan debt here as well, but a lot of what we're hearing about here is kind of non-loan debt, unpaid bills, fines and fees, and how that ripple, that spiral, is actually maybe even more damaging to long-term financial well-being in that family or community than the presenting debt itself. Is that true? Is that what
Well,
you're seeing?
we've gone forward to prove even beyond that it's detrimental to the system itself. Because you cannot get blood from a turnip. I don't care how you try. And so you're actually not reaching your goal as the predatory system, because if people aren't paying it, you aren't getting those resources or that debt. But if you create an ability to pay, then people can actually pay it, even if they're paying it slower, and you will recoup those. And I'm
you're
sorry,
saying that
I
people
keep
wanna
getting
pay.
into you guys' thing.
No,
but
no,
I mean, we went on a mission to prove that, okay, you guys aren't even accomplishing what you're trying to do. So let's work together to figure out how we can change this, because it's not helping anybody. Yeah.
Is there any other kind of like that back tail end in terms of understanding the problem, and how long it can persist, or what the follow-on consequences are? Is there anything else that's really helpful to understand as we go into a solutions conversation?
Well, I mean, so we focused a lot on, the last year, focused on driver's license suspensions. And in North Carolina, as I said, after 100 days, you lose your license based on failure to pay. And again, we're generally talking about administrative fees, because fines are very low in the traffic context.
And it starts out, I can imagine an administrator's position, you'd say, well, that'll get their attention. We'll get this right. So was it really?
Well, that's the thing, is like
did it start out to be there wasn't malintent, was there? I think that, did they understand the follow-on consequences?
I would say malintent bleeds into negligence. I mean,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
you sort of understand how it plays out in low-income households. But exactly, like a fine is meant to be a punishment. A fee is not meant to be a punishment. And so, and just so, you know, over the past 20 years, just one example is where the General Court of Justice fee, anytime you're in court and are convicted, that's what you're charged. And so it was $41 in 1995. Now it's $147. Failure to appear, if you didn't go to court and then you do go to court, a few years ago it was $50. Now it's $200. And basically, you know, any traffic ticket that you have, that's an additional $10. And it just really adds up. And what people say is, when they have this and they can't pay it, is it profoundly impacts their lives. And so, just to give some examples, we've hosted clinics to basically remit this debt and get rid of it based on a showing of an inability to pay. Now, there's two real issues here, is that judges, even when they are looking at ability to pay, and there is a Supreme Court case that says, at least in the context of putting somebody in prison, there is some duty under the Constitution to look at their ability to pay. The problem is, it's not set out what ability to pay means, and so you have a wide divergence in what that means. And it usually, traditionally, has been, does somebody have two nickels to rub together? And if they do, both of those should go to pay this criminal justice debt, not looking at the financial instability that causes when they're not paying their rent, not paying their transportation, groceries, all that sort of stuff. But once you actually lose your license, that's where it really profoundly impacts your life. And so what we hear from people we're serving is that either they don't drive anymore, and that means you either have to live on a bus line, and your job has to be on a bus line. Again, there aren't many bus lines in North Carolina. You have to borrow a ride from family members, and they say when it's raining and cold outside, it's a lot harder to get that ride than it is other places. You miss your job a couple times and get fired. It's hard to go job hunting when you don't have a license. We hear about, you have a kid with asthma who has asthma attacks, and to get to the emergency room becomes even more of a crisis if you don't have a driver's license. And then you have this whole other issue of people who do continue to drive. Because you sort of need it. And so, and that's when what you were talking about, getting channeled into the criminal justice system, and being put on probation. And it bleeds into failure to appear in court, where, generally traffic court is not about guilt or innocence. People generally were speeding or were driving without an expired registration, and it's just going and pleading to one case and having the other case dismissed, and having those fees. And so once you sort of know how that game goes, and you don't have the money, you just don't go. And that in North Carolina also leads to an indefinite suspension. So we're talking about 1.2 million people in North Carolina with an indefinite suspension of their driver's license based on either failure to appear or failure to pay. There's only 10 million people in the entire state.
Wow.
So it's a huge issue.
10% of the population with suspended licenses. Wow. And you said so many
I raised you
important
by
things.
10.
Oh, yeah?
You go ahead. Give me some scale numbers here. Go ahead. Let's talk about the systemic nature of this.
Imagine in Illinois, all of Illinois, and Chicago is huge within itself, and a lot of this predication takes place because so we want the systems the same way they work together to create the predication and filter people into prisons, which is big business, we know. We want them to work together the same way to figure these things out. Even the fact that people don't know how to navigate the processes is a big problem. Even the fact that they don't communicate with each other within these systems. So the police have their whole level of predication, driving down our streets at 4 a.m., just searching for things to write tickets for, to pile them up. I have a picture that I keep in my phone of an entire street in my community that had boots on both sides of the street on one given day at 4 a.m. in the morning. Now, if that isn't proof of predication, I don't know what is. But just to have those systems know what the other system is doing in a restorative way, the same way they do, filtering it into their negative, and I will say intentional, I ain't scared of y'all, intentional way that they do to create the billions that they try to create off the backs of people who are just trying to live like everyone else is. So we need to bring the human back. That's what's missing when we're talking about solutions, the human aspect.
I want to do a mic drop right there, but we actually have a couple of minutes for final statements right there, the human aspect of this. And I think that's actually what it's going to take, is humanizing this. And I also think that you scratch the surface of any community and you find these issues are being contended with. But it is interesting that there is a bit of a parallel universe, almost the Harry Potter wall, that happens where many people's experience of debt is a constructive thing in their lives, right? Most people in this room, where your first experience of debt is the credit card that your parents co-signed for, or the down payment that you're helped with to get a home. There's a very different experience of debt being a productive thing, and I think something that's come up with Epic, right? We're not trying to demonize debt per se. I do think that overall, access to credit is an incredibly important part of building the life you want. But these ways that debt is consequential and harmful, and that we actually haven't unpacked it and understood what that actually means for these families. We work very closely, for example, with our workforce and job skills, with the Future of Work and the Economic Opportunities programs. It's really helpful to start putting these issues side by side and saying, okay, on the one hand, we're working on all the skills training in the world, and we're working on the career paths, and we're working on the quality of jobs. And then to have these completely separate issues be the real issue.
You took my car and now I can't use those skills.
So I guess, thinking about this boundary crossing issue, I guess in a final word from each of you, for others who care about low-income households and spend their time thinking about either policies or the products that are going to be empowering and fixed, what would you say to them about why care about consumer debt? Why look at that? If you're looking at these other issues of helping people get a better chance in life. So as a final thing, what might you say to somebody who's already on board that they want people to have opportunity? Why should they care about this issue?
You go for it, because we've talked.
Okay.
Everybody's here.
What I was going to say is, when you listen to both of what's North Carolina and Chicago, what we're hearing is how one event can snowball into crisis. And debt, whether it's first starting through the criminal justice system or it's starting through predatory lender or a combination of both, what it ultimately does for families that are living on margin is it ultimately spirals into an actual crisis.
And I guess I'd add to that probably the medical debt or the unpaid bills that also end up in that same category of non-loan.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so if you are borrowing money to pay a fine so you don't lose your license, and you borrow that money and suddenly it's at a high level, and then and ultimately you didn't want to lose your license, but you are now at risk of losing your car, or you don't show up because you can't afford to pay the fine and you're driving under suspension, but you're driving under suspension because you've got to make sure that you pay your rent and that your kids are being fed because you don't want to lose your children, because if you don't pay your rent, you're going to be evicted. I mean, it just shows how all of this builds crisis upon crisis. And what we shouldn't be doing is having families have to build their lives on one crisis after another, and we have to look at how do we unpack all of that and allow families to live with a sense of security, so that if in fact an event happens in your life, whether it's, you were speeding and now you've got a ticket, the ticket is not going to then take you and spiral you out of control so that you're having to go borrow to the next, or you're going to have to worry about whether or not you're not going to have your car so that you can go to that job, so that you can afford to pay your ticket. And people don't live in silos. Yeah. And I think that's what we've thought about when we think about debt and all of these expenses, is that it's all siloed, but it isn't. It's all interconnected, and we have to be unpacking all of this and recognizing the impact of all of it and coming up with policies that complement each other so that we can stop this spiral out of control.
Great. Absolutely. And I present just a couple of quick things. One being the law of economics. You can't just keep taking from particular communities and think that there won't be impact on the other communities. Because as I've presented to legislators before, once you've taken everything from us and then we robbed and pillaged everything that we have, you're next. I'm sorry, that was not a threat. And then let's consider the Constitution. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And I'm going to turn it over to you after that one. I mean, just that one little line says everything we need to be thinking about. We're the people. That means we don't leave other people behind. That means that we all work together to make America great again, because that's the only way America's going to ever be great, is if we all love each other enough to care when we're harming someone else.
Thanks, Rosalia.
Well, I thought that was well said by both of you guys. I mean, I would just add that it's sort of what I started with, that whether you're talking about barriers in the criminal justice system or legal financial obligations, what I experience most with hundreds of people I've met with is people striving for a better life and really wanting opportunities, and just fundamentally isolated from that by these barriers. And so, and you always have to emphasize here the disproportionate, catastrophic impact on people of color and families of color. I mean, when we look in the driver's license context, when we look at long-term driver's license suspensions, and you see people, we actually got data from the Administrative Office of the Courts that showed these 1.2 million people, and you see they've had these suspensions for 25 years, 20 years. I mean, if you don't pay it off in the first 2 years, it is very rare for it to get paid off. And so, and the majority of those individuals are people of color. And so that's what I try to emphasize in any of these conversations, that I think you can see sort of how people are being set up to fail here. I think based on our own experiences driving, you can understand the impact, but it's always important to understand which communities are most impacted by this.
Daniel, Sue, Rosalia, thank you for the work you're doing on the ground. Thank you for helping us all understand here the systemic, consequential aspects of debt. And thank you for all of your partnership in EPIC.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to ask Catherine Lucas-McKay from EPIC to come on up and go ahead and give a bit of an overview about the entire report that we were releasing today. Thanks.
You got me a hand?
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay,
Good morning, everyone. I am here to provide that overview that Ida mentioned, and also to be the bridge between hearing from community leaders, folks who are living these issues, and folks who are on the ground working in communities, to our panel of solutions experts, the folks who are really on the front lines of innovating about what to do about these problems that people experience. As we talk, I'm going to leave up this slide right here, which you also have in the materials we handed out to you. And what I want to do as we discuss this framework for both understanding the problems that people have with consumer debt and thinking through what success for them would look like, that is what gets us to the goals for solutions and ultimately to the solutions that we think are the most promising themselves. I think like Ida, you said mic drop. The most important thing we heard in the previous panel was that communities and people and the human factor matters so deeply. And that is something that, from the EPIC perspective, we try to draw people from every part of the financial industry, the research world, different private sector stakeholders, and people in communities who are doing this work, who are living this day to day. And that is one of the most important sources of wisdom that has informed the development of this framework. As I lay out the framework, what I would like to do is just offer you all the opportunity to think about these things in terms of the 3 specific issues that we've heard the most about so far and that we'll be hearing more about on the solutions panel. Those are delinquency, default, and collections, student loan burdens, and government fines and fees. You'll see that those are 3 of the 7 problems listed up here on this slide and on the one-pager that was on your seat when you arrived. These 7 problems are what emerged from this 18-month research process, and they represent 4 kind of failure points in the process, the life cycle of credit and debt that consumers experience as they either borrow and repay, potentially struggle, or don't choose to borrow but incur debt anyways, and then are in that repayment and struggle experience. A lot of times, what would be better for people is not to have to borrow in that situation or to be able to borrow a more affordable, reasonable amount. And as we thought through, well, how do you solve people's debt problems? That's a really important one, but it's not always the answer. Part of it is that you don't have to go to a predatory lender, that instead you can access a super affordable loan potentially from your credit union, from community lenders, and even from mainstream lenders. And then finally, once people start to struggle, what do we do to help? The answer is not as simple as shutting down access to credit or opening it up in some of the ways that we have tried to do over the last few decades. Instead, it is thinking about what people really need. And so there are 3 key moments when solutions can operate, when you can get to strategies that can really solve these problems for people. And those are in advance of borrowing. That's when reducing liabilities, preventing liabilities from being incurred in the first place is really important. And threading it through to some of what we heard, that would be setting fines and fees at levels that people can afford to repay, making sure that judges do have the discretion and the tools to be able to understand what ability to repay actually means. Other types of solutions that would reduce the need to borrow on the front end, the student loan space is a clear one. The costs there are nearly insurmountable right now to absorb without borrowing for the majority of families. And given that, helping people need to borrow less upfront, especially people who are coming out of low-income families who don't have the level of resources that middle class and higher income folks have, is really, really an important part of the solution there. Of course, borrowing to be able to go to college, just to keep running with this example, is incredibly important. It has opened up access to better paying jobs to millions of people over the years. It has, in fact, raised incomes, even though it has sometimes reduced your disposable income because of the cost of repaying your loans. So there, what's important is addressing the front end. What is the product that people are taking out? So in the student loan scenario, what are we looking at in terms of interest on federal loans? What are we looking at in terms of the way that repayment works and subsidies work? If you're looking at other types of debt, what are the basic loan terms and features of, for example, your credit card? Finding ways of improving products at the front end in the design stage so that when people borrow, they are borrowing the highest quality possible, they're using the highest quality possible credit that they can and setting themselves up for success in repayment rather than failure. The final key intervention point is at the back end. Some people are able to just fully pay off a loan that they receive. It's fine. A lot of people at some point will struggle, whether that is on all their debt, on a particular type of debt, and being able to implement interventions that help that struggle be as easy as possible for people and to get them back on track for success is also a really critical opportunity and one where there's so much room for innovation, and it's something I'm really excited that y'all will hear about in the next few minutes. So turning to this one-pager, looking up on the screen, we've talked about these 7 key problems, 3 of which we are going to focus on in a little bit more depth across these 2 panels today. And from there, our job is to imagine what success looks like from the consumer's perspective. And that doesn't just mean imagining, it means talking to folks and letting them speak for themselves. What does success mean to you? What would a life that has debt in it mean if it were not crushing? Sometimes people can't imagine the answer to that. And one of our jobs is to help through that process of finding what that answer might be for you when debt seems like such a challenge that it could never turn into an opportunity. So back-end solutions are things like saying, hey, if you want to pay us what you can afford to pay us, we'll take it. We are not going to tell you it's all or nothing. That really isn't going to help anyone. It's things like auditing your collections practices. We heard that sometimes it doesn't even make financial sense to keep pursuing collections on balances you will never get back. Especially for public institutions, that's an important tool. Other back-end solutions, when we're talking about student loans, a key one is student loan forgiveness and debt cancellation. What is happening once someone starts to struggle? That 11% of people who are currently in default, or this is a really frightening one, the 40% of people who are anticipated to default at some point during their repayment. That's incredible. 44 million households so far, people so far, holding student loan debt, 40% of whom are expected to default at some point. We have to do something at the back end to help those folks actually be able to continue to repay their student loans and to get the value out of their education that they were promised that they would get. So, identifying the goals, I'm going to talk through just what we identified on those 3. And the first, in delinquency, default, and collections, there are 2 separate things. One, once someone begins to struggle, that first, you're 3 days late, what happens? And we think that what success would look like is that people who become delinquent or default would have opportunities to cure. That's something that the private sector is already doing some work to implement creative solutions, and we'll hear more about that. The other goal is that people who have debt in collections enjoy their full legal rights and don't lose their livelihood or end up in jail. Those seem like really simple repayment principles. On student loans, post-secondary education should be more affordable for everyone. And an important part that we haven't touched on in as much depth, but is covered very well in the report itself, is that student loans should be more equitable in both cost and benefit for people of color. One of the major problems is that this has increased access to higher ed and decent jobs And it has widened the racial wealth gap because of the amount that it takes people to have to enroll, that they have to borrow to enroll, the amount that people are paid, and the fact that there is a racial wage gap, and then the impact of negative amortization of people's loans. The balances just grow after you graduate. And I kind of can't imagine anything more depressing than watching your student loan balance get bigger as you make payments. And then finally, for people who are making their student loan repayments but need some additional help, looking at opportunities for things like how do employers support and what are the additional options on loan forgiveness that we haven't quite looked at. So that's how we have come to the set of goals that we have. I'm about to turn it back over to another panel of leaders, this time focused on the solutions side. I'd like to invite my colleague David Mitchell up, and he will get us started on that.
Thank you, Catherine. Quick stage change here. Give us a moment. If you all want to join me on stage, please take a seat. Just in the order you're sitting is fine. So Anne, if you're here. Thanks, Catherine. I'm very excited for this panel because we get to talk about solutions now. I think there's been a nice logical progression here of the morning, and we're at kind of the most exciting point, in my opinion. I am the Associate Director here at the Financial Security Program for Policy and Market Solutions, so I'm focused very much on how we build consensus and leadership around solving Americans' most challenging financial issues, and consumer debt is certainly one of those. So I'm very excited to hear from the innovators that we have on stage today, both because I know they will inspire leaders out in the room and watching online to do great things and solve problems related to consumer debt, and also just selfishly because we at Aspen are very eager to partner with you and others around potential solutions to this really serious problem that we've heard about today. So let me start by just introducing the panelists, and then we'll jump into the conversation. To my immediate left is Anne Stuhldreher. She is the first ever Director of Financial Justice with the City and County of San Francisco. And I'm pleased to announce not just a potential partner, but an actual partner. Anne is going to be a senior fellow with the Financial Security Program for the next year, working on fines and fees, which you've heard so much about. Alex Smith is the third chair down. She is the Chief Human Resources Officer with the City of Memphis. Formerly, she served in HR management roles with Target and Microsoft, among other companies. In between them is Jerry Namorin. He is the founder and CEO of LendStreet, a financial health platform that helps consumers negotiate and pay off debt. He previously worked in the global corporate and investment banking division of Bank of America Merrill Lynch. And Catherine Lucas McKay, you've already met. She is a program manager here at Aspen FSP and has been doing all of the great research that led us to the solutions framework that was released today. So we've heard a lot about the harm that consumer debt can cause to vulnerable families. I want to maybe just start by having the three innovators kind of explain what they and their organizations are doing to try to prevent or mitigate that harm. And I'd like to go in rough order of kind of the life cycle of debt that Catherine laid out. So, there's the in advance, how can we prevent debt from accruing even before it starts, which I kind of think of in the fines and fees in Anne's world. This is pretty rough. Alex, there's help people need to keep current on their obligations and not go into delinquency or default. And then there's the back end, Jerry, which I know LendStreet can speak to, about how do we help distressed borrowers get back on track. So Anne, do you mind starting us off?
Yeah, I would love to. And thanks so much for having me here today. Once again, my name is Anne Stuhldreher. I direct the Financial Justice Project for the City and County of San Francisco. Is that me? And what that is we're taking a hard look at all of our fines, fees, tickets, financial penalties that often have a disproportionate impact on lower income people and people of color. And we decided to start this, I can't believe it, 2 years ago, when we started hearing stories from people across San Francisco and California, much like the ones we heard on the previous panel. I know that we heard from people like Mary Vandegrift, who 2 years ago went to jail in San Francisco, and when she got out, she was doing everything right. She got a job, she got clean from her addiction, she reunited with her daughter, and then our city and county stunned her with a bill for $1,800 to pay for 3 years of upfront monthly probation fees. We heard from women like Pamela Lynott. She's a disabled senior citizen, and she got her car towed for the first time in her 49-year driving history. And the tow was $412, which was half of her monthly income from Social Security. And she paid it, but then she couldn't pay her rent, and she faced eviction. And in San Francisco at that time, 10% of all cars that were towed were never retrieved because people couldn't pay the tow fees. We heard, like Daniel and others mentioned, about 17% of Californians who'd had their driver's license suspended for inability to pay. And we heard from thousands of parents across California who had gotten a bill when their child was locked up in juvenile hall, almost like it was a hotel for room and board. I interviewed one young man in Sacramento whose grandmother got a bill for $25,000 when he got out, and she had to declare bankruptcy. And, this is, as we heard previously, fines and fees are spreading throughout government and the courts, and when people can't pay them, serious consequences set in. Fines grow through late fees, credit scores go down, driver's licenses are suspended, jobs are lost. These are dramatic impacts that we're talking about, and lives can be ruined. And so as we looked at this from the treasurer's office where I work, it just seemed like such a lose-lose proposition for government and for people. Surely we can hold people accountable without putting them in financial distress. And surely we can find ways to balance our books that is not on the backs of people who are really struggling. So we started the Financial Justice Project under the leadership of Treasurer Jose Cisneros. And he's in charge of revenue for the city and county of San Francisco, and I report to him. And so I have two main jobs, really. I do a lot of listening just to people to understand what are the biggest fine and fee pain points in our community. And then I work with other departments and the courts to try to find solutions that are doable, but will really make a difference in people's lives. So we've done a bunch of things. We became the first county in the nation to stop suspending people's driver's licenses when they couldn't pay traffic fines. Other counties followed suit, and Jerry Brown eliminated this onerous penalty statewide. And in his veto message, he called the DMV a hellhole of despair. And then other states are also advancing these reforms. We cut towing and boot fees in half for lower income people. For people who were struggling with parking tickets, we created this new payment plan for low-income people. So previously, people had to pay $65 to get onto a payment plan, and there were a lot of other fees as well. When we got rid of those fees, something interesting happened. People signing up for payment plans went up 400%, and revenue went up for our city as well. So again, if you make it easier for people to pay, and more doable, they will pay. I think one of the things I'm most proud of is that we became the first county in the nation to eliminate all administrative fees that we are charging to people who are coming out of jail or our criminal justice system. So this is, thank you. these are things like a $50 a month probation fee, a up to $35 a day fee to rent your ankle monitor. These fees are high pain for people and low gain for government. So on that monthly probation fee, the collection rate was just 9%. There's something wrong when the collection rate is 9%. Mayor London Breed stood up and announced we were writing off $32 million in debt that was owed by 21,000 people in our community for these fees. And that is money that was never going to come in, but it's hanging over thousands of people like Mary and hit them right when they're trying to get back on their feet. I really believe that there are, and we're seeing in San Francisco, that there are solutions that work both better for people and for government. So a lot of other California counties are advancing these reforms. There's a new statewide coalition that's launching soon called Californians for Debt-Free Justice. There's great momentum in Chicago. There's momentum all over the country. So I'm really hopeful that we can move forward on this.
And can you just clarify for those who maybe don't know, you mentioned cities, you mentioned counties, you've mentioned some state legislation. There seems like there's things to do at all levels, but can you kind of clarify who holds which purse strings or which power? I mean, it might differ by jurisdiction, but.
How long do we have? That's a great question. And there are things that can be done at the city, county, state, and federal level. I think we all need to come together on this, but people can kind of start from different vantage points.
Great. So Alex, I want to move to you. You all have been doing some very innovative financial wellness interventions in the city of Memphis. Can you share?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. I want to first start off and say that I'm coming at this completely from a human resources standpoint. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a politician. So I think I just want to make that clarification in terms of how we ended up actually going down this journey. For us, when we came into office in January of 2016, we had one clear focus, which was attracting and retaining talent for the city of Memphis. And so as an employer, the city of Memphis is around 8,000. We employ about 8,000, 6,500 full-time, 1,500 part-time. And so as we were exploring this journey around how to best do this, we did engagement surveys and benchmarking surveys. We did town halls, et cetera. And overwhelmingly, we were hearing from employees around issues with compensation, specifically compensation and retirement. And so as we started digging deeper to understand more about what was going on, we started to understand these issues around financial burden, debt, et cetera, going on with our population. So our first initial action was around, okay, well, we'll tweak some of our current programs. So we did a few small tweaks to our healthcare plan and to our tuition reimbursement program. But then as we started moving further, we started investing more in financial literacy classes and seeing that we were getting them actually sold out. So our employees were wanting to have more information about that. Then we started doing some research around, okay, well, what are some other challenges that our employees are having? And so that's when this issue around student loan debt came about, where we realized that in the city of Memphis as a whole, there's a relatively high student loan debt ratio. And so we did a pilot. We, knowing that there wasn't a ton of employers that were involved in the student loan space, wanted to understand a little bit more about what it could look like for us. So we did a small pilot just to see. And a few things. One is that we got a huge positive reception from the small pilot that we did. Two, we started to understand that our employees were carrying a large amount of debt, which we were not really sure of. So when we actually rolled it out to all of our employees, that's when the numbers were really telling. And so ultimately, when you think about government agency, you think about police and fire and public works. And I would be honest, just blue collar jobs. So going into it, I didn't expect that we would have high amounts of student loan debt. There would be some, but not a huge amount. And boy, were we surprised, right? So a year into the program, our employees, so we have 491 employees that are in the program. They have $20 million worth of debt. among just 491, with more than 50% of them being people in police and fire. So you're thinking about professions, they make on, their base wage is on average $55,000 a year, and they're carrying between $25,000 and $30,000 worth of debt on average for those divisions. And then we also noticed something interesting. So we thought it was going to be a young person's issue, and this was going to help us with recruiting new recruits, fresh, 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds. And then we realized that people in the program were ranging from ages of 21 all the way to 65. And the average age of participant in our program is 41. So we quickly understood that this student loan debt issue is not a young person's issue. It's not a white collar or professional issue. It is an all profession issue. And so we're seeing debt levels among all our populations, including police and fire and public works. We're seeing high amounts. And so the average amount of debt for our employees is $42,000 for municipal employees. So that has now expanded our whole perspective about financial literacy and financial wellness. And so we're making even more investments. So a few things. One is that we have some great partners. So we've been working with Operation Hope around credit repair and more financial literacy work. We've instituted a 401A matching program for our Social Security employees to help them with expediting their retirement, helping support that more. And then we're now getting way more depth into actually having more budgeting classes and more support for our employees all in. So it's become a major point for us. We know that our employees need it. And then we have some really positive evidence. So for our employees who are participating in the student loan program, we've actually seen a 25% increase in their contributions in their 457B program. Wow. So seeing that transition of, okay, so we're helping to remove some of this debt, and now they're actually saving more towards retirement is really big. So we know that this is something that we need to continue to keep our eye on and continue to work on. But it's been tremendous.
That's great. And just nuts and bolts, like how do you get people aware of the program and how do you market it to your employees? And then it's some amount of money per month that the city is paying towards the thing. I should say also that some of the stats that Alex shared are in a one-pager that are in the packet that you all have.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
So, quite frankly, we decided on the amount based on our budget. So, there's only so much that we can do. So we contribute $50 per month towards the principal of individual student loans payments. It has to be their own personal loan. It can't be loans of their kids, et cetera. And once they hit 1 year of service, they get an automatic email from our third-party provider letting them know that they can register their loan, and that starts the process.
Got it. Thanks. So Jerry, we know that not everybody makes it through the gauntlet intact, and some come out the other side quite distressed with their consumer debt. How does Lend Street intervene?
Yeah, I think the theme, the consistent theme from the conversations today is if you put people in the right position with the right and provide solutions that actually fit their capacity, that they will pay. And that was the heart of the Lend Street thesis, is that consumers who are historically good payers, when they hit a financial shock and they become delinquent, that these are the same consumers. They've always had the propensity to pay. It's just now they don't have the capacity to pay. And so how do we bridge that capacity with the intent? And so Lend Street was really born out of based on an idea that was applied during the credit crisis. I was working on Wall Street helping major businesses restructure their debt. One of our clients, we advised them to get capital from their financial sponsor, which is a private equity firm, to buy back their own debt. And effectively delevered the company or reduced the debt on the company significantly. And they bought it at 12.5 cents on the dollar. So I thought, why can't we do the same for consumers? And so the major question was, one, who's going to be there to provide the capital to the consumer so they can pay off their delinquent debt, even though we know creditors are willing to provide a discount when that consumer is delinquent or distressed, but they usually want their money right away or over a short payment plan. And obviously with consumers, we see our customers on average come in with $30,000 of unsecured debt. Very similar profile, average age is above 50. And so, these are consumers who are thick file, who historically made their payments because they were able to have access to $30,000 or more. But when they hit a financial shock, no one is there to help them, right? And the consistent question that we got when we were pitching this idea was, will these people pay? Literally, these people, right? It wasn't, it was almost as though these are deadbeats, or these are people who got themselves into this situation and who weren't, capable or worthy of a second chance. And so we strongly believe that, I have a line that's, zebras don't change stripes. So if a consumer is thick file, they had access to capital, they've proven themselves in the past, the issue that's, is more, I think we talked a little bit about in the EPIC contextual, right? Putting context around the person's situation. And that was the big vision for Lend Street is, let's look at this person not as they are today, but who they are, who they've proven themselves to be in the past, and be able to find that right solution that gives them a path to financial rehabilitation and rebuild their credit. So today we help consumers. We have partners that will negotiate the debt. We give them a loan to pay it off. We see credit scores improve on average, the median actually, by 80 points within 12 months, over 100 points within 18 months, and reducing their debt by 30% on average, and payments similarly by 30%. And we're seeing defaults, below 10%, so way below what we would expect, what you would expect for a consumer with an average score of 560.
And can you just distinguish what you offer to what else is was already existing in the market? I mean, I feel like
Sure.
we see on TV, call this 800 number to get your debt reduced. There's clearly offerings out there. Some seem more predatory than others. But how does Lend Street distinguish itself, and what is that ecosystem like?
So, when consumers are delinquent, there's probably 4 different options, right? You have debt consolidation, which is what you hear, the Prosper Lending Club. The new lending companies, debt consolidation has become a big piece of the lending landscape. So that's one option. But you have that requires a certain credit score, a certain capacity, and for consumers that we're focused on, it's unlikely that they would be able to access those solutions. And then you have credit counseling, which typically will work with the creditors to reduce your interest rate down to below 10%. Or 10% or below, and it gives you a longer time to pay. So effectively takes your credit card debt and turn it into an installment sort of product that you pay over a longer period. You pay over 5 years, up to 5 years. So that allows you to pay at a lower interest, get out of debt within a defined time period. And then you have debt settlement. And debt settlement is you can think of it as a out of court Chapter 13 bankruptcy, right? It's effectively allowing you to restructure your debt, but not through the court system. Because what they'll do is they'll say, okay, set up an account, stop making the payments to the creditors, because the creditors, the only way you're able to negotiate a debt with a creditor is if you're a delinquent. Otherwise, creditors are going to negotiate or take a lower principal if you're current. So, you set up a payment plan, you make payments into these accounts, you're delinquent, typically on average it's 6 accounts, $30,000 of debt, so you're making $500 plus payments into this savings account. And as you save enough, then they go out and they negotiate with your creditor one by one. And so it's over 48 months, typically 48 to 60 months. So about 1 account to 1.5 every year gets negotiated and paid off. Meanwhile, you're delinquent, and so and those payments aren't being reflected on your credit report, and so your credit scores remain, subprime. And lastly, you have bankruptcy, and bankruptcy I don't think I need to really explain, but the thing with bankruptcy, it's a permanent scarlet letter. The question that we often get on every application we fill out is, have you ever filed for bankruptcy? It's not, have you filed for bankruptcy in the last 7 years, which is when it's, it stays it stays on your credit report. It's, have you ever? And so that impacts where the consumer can live. It impacts the jobs they can have. And what we've also seen, the data shown, is that the credit scores also don't increase or rebound as quickly. And they have less access to capital going forward after a bankruptcy. And so what Lend Street does is really try to take the best of all of those four options, right? So we leverage the debt settlement model to negotiate down the debt for the consumer. We bring a loan to the table like the consolidation product, and we effectively do a Chapter 13 bankruptcy restructuring, but out of court, and take the creditors out of there. So helping the creditors accelerate their recovery. We think of it from a system perspective. So, by bringing capital to the space, accelerating the recovery for the creditors, accelerating the rehabilitation of the consumer, ideally, we'll see a lower loss rate on the creditor side, which means interest rates should be lower for everyone, hopefully, right? Because they'll have a higher recovery. And for the consumer, they'll be able to rebound quickly enough that they can get back into the system and get access to credit at a lower interest rate, which we've seen. About 10% of our customers, refinance us out of the debt, so out of our loans. So about 55% of them are homeowners. So we're seeing that the thesis is playing out to be the case.
Interesting. So Catherine, I want to bring you into this conversation. We've heard now about these three specific interventions. You've spent a lot of work trying to kind of bridge this huge topic of consumer debt. Help us contextualize these interventions within the framework that we're releasing today.
Sure. So I think one of the most important pieces of context here that folks have alluded to is the context of people's lives, that no one is carrying one product and no one is talking to one regulator and no one is balancing their budgets line item by line item. It's all about patching together your life and how that works. So really approaching this from the consumer's perspective, inhabiting the experience. We all can inhabit the experience of being a borrower or a debtor because almost all of us, even the guy in the back who raised his hand, our one non-debted person, probably at some point has had that. And that really helps you think about when were the points when it would have been helpful to me to not have to borrow, to get a better deal, or to have some help making it work. I think that the folks on stage represent a really important range of the stakeholders who have huge roles to play here. From the public policy side, and I'd also say, taking a fellowship here with us and the work that you've done collaborating with other cities is a really important resource for the field of policy. And having, you're an employer and thinking of it from a different perspective, but most folks who have incurred student loan debt have jobs. Most people, especially in today's economy, are working. And they're still struggling. And the people who are most impacted by that struggle, other than their families, are their employers. So there's a lot to bring to the table in terms of interest and engagement and ways to be creative. And then reinventing what's not working in default and collections is critical. Some of that is going to require policy changes, things around bankruptcy, things around people's rights when they are experiencing collections, things that happen once they've been sued. But on the private sector side, there's just this enormous potential for both creative and innovative new ideas, like Lend Street, or for traditional institutions, banks that we all know, the fintech sector, to take a look at what their own processes are and say, what's not working for us as well as what's not working for the consumer? If you can get someone in that first week of delinquency back to paying, everyone does better. So what are you doing to help that happen? And we've seen some firms say, we're not, but we sure can. And I think that that's a really exciting piece of the full range of what people can do here. I'd also just add to that you really do hear, whether it's a specific product, eventually what it gets down to is people come to Jerry and Len Street and say, I have 6 different products and I can't manage any of this at this point. So being able to have people understand that consumer point of view and not think of people as those people, but as all of us, but for one financial emergency, I think is also a really important way to approach this.
That's well said. And I do want to open it up to questions from the audience here in a moment, so start thinking of questions. And if you're watching online, you can tweet questions at us. In the meantime, while you're thinking, I'll pose a few more. The first, I guess, back to you, Anne. So changing institutions, bringing a new idea to the table in a city bureaucracy seems kind of intimidating, probably to a lot of people listening. Which arguments were the most effective in trying to navigate that? I mean, and were there different arguments that were more effective for different audiences? So you probably had to convince court systems of one thing and budget officers and police departments. I mean, there's lots of different players here. If you were to draw up a roadmap for others in other cities who are thinking about doing this work, kind of what would be your advice?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Look, every community is different. I think some of the things we found were effective in San Francisco is oftentimes people in government and the courts get kind of buffered from the public. So just explaining the impacts, of what's happening would sometimes move people to action. I also think understanding, and we're learning more and more about this in San Francisco and other places, that reforming fines and fees doesn't automatically mean less revenue. We saw I didn't mention that California counties started to stop charging these fees to parents whose children were locked up in juvenile hall. That spread throughout California counties, and California became the first state to eliminate those onerous fees that were hanging over tens of thousands of families. UC Berkeley did a study that showed that for many of the counties, they were spending more to collect those fees than they were bringing in. We also are finding, and there's some great research being done out of UCLA by a woman named Beth Colgan, who's looked at some court pilot programs that showed that when you proportion a fine to someone's income, they pay it more readily. And again, the revenue can actually go up and the disproportionate impact can go down. And again, we're seeing that in San Francisco. So I think that those are a few of the things we found are effective with our colleagues.
Well, you've been very successful, so it seems to be working. I guess a similar question to you, Alex, in terms of that win-win argument. I mean, you've been in both the public and private sector doing HR. What are the most effective arguments for getting an employer to think a little bit more expansively about their benefits, not just retirement maybe, but student loan repayment or other offerings?
Yes. And one other program I forgot to mention is that we also help with medical debt as well. So we have health reimbursement accounts for both our active employees and our retirees that also help towards that, as well as wellness incentives to help get them to do the right thing. So that helps as well. So there's kind of two pieces. On the budget side, the way that I have a conversation with our CFO is essentially it's net neutral for us. So what we did is we looked at across all of our HR programs and what were some of the programs that were underperforming and said, okay, well, let's divert dollars from those programs over into this new student loan program and see how it works. And so that, if you will, reprioritization made our budget people really happy and allowed for us to experiment and try something new. So that's how we did that argument. On the HR side of it, essentially I made an important pitch to our mayor and as I talked to other HR leaders across the country is twofold. So one is around the ability to attract and retain. So on the attraction side, particularly for police and fire, we're looking for people between the ages of 19 and 21 to go into those roles. And so, being able to offer something that no other municipality offers in the country, I think, puts us a cut above others. And so that helps us in our value proposition statement to get people to want to come join our organization. On the second piece, on the engagement side, what the surveys have shown us is that we actually have a higher engagement from employees who are part of the student loan program versus who are not, and those who are in part of our financial wellness programs and who aren't. And so we're able to make this clear argument that through us having these financial wellness initiatives that we're able to drive for not only attracting the right people, but retaining them as well through the extra support that we provide.
And Jerry, I guess similar question to you, because you have to convince funders in some cases, right, to give you money. You talked about the conversation you had with investors wondering if these people are able to pay. What is your answer? How do you convince folks who are so divorced from this problem to see what you see and see an opportunity as opposed to a risk?
Yeah, for us, it was a matter of putting what I will say, we call it putting points on the board, right? The only thing that can change that perception is to show it. But we approach this with the mindset of it has to be a win-win-win value proposition. And that's what we're hearing here, right? There are several stakeholders in that process. And we have to make sure that everyone is aligned because that's the only way we'll succeed is if everybody finds value in this product and make sure that we can deliver that for the consumer, which as long as we're being fair to the consumer, we're putting them in a product that makes sense for them and for what they can afford, we believe they'll perform, and they've proven that out. For our partners, it's helping them accelerate their fee or accelerating their recovery on those debt. And that's proven out. And then for our investors, it's a matter of getting a return that's commensurate with the risk. And so we really focus on being a market-based solution to ensure that we always it's sustainable, right? And we can also always have access to capital to continue to fuel the growth and scale this.
Thanks. So I want to open it up. If anybody in the audience has questions, I'll call on you, and then a mic will come over, and you can introduce yourself. That'd be great. Right there in the middle back.
Yeah, hi. This has been fascinating. I've learned a lot. Jerry, I'm very intrigued by what you're up to.
Oh, sorry. And who are you?
Who am I?
Yeah.
Anonymous. I'm a sociologist, and my name is Mindy Reiser. I'm curious, Jerry, how you let people know about what your service is, and then how do you make that additional income, the profit that enables you to continue to do this work?
Sure. Today, we primarily partner with settlement companies who already have these clients, and they're in their 48-month program. So we're helping them accelerate the client's journey, the settlement process. So of the four solutions that I talked about earlier, debt settlement is the industry that helps people negotiate down debt, but it's typically over a 48-month plan. And so we're saying, show me your customer list, let me underwrite them, and we'll accelerate that settlement. Instead of a 48-month plan, now that customer can be in this program for no more than 6 to 9 months.
So let me interrupt then. So an individual cannot approach you directly?
They can. They do. They can and they do. We just haven't had a outward-facing marketing plan, largely because the main thing we had to prove out was that these are consumers who are worthy of a loan and who could pay. And so we had to find the shortest path to proving out that concept. So so they can and they do.
Yeah, please.
And I just have a follow-up question. Hi, I'm Sabrina Terry with Unidos US, formerly the National Council of La Raza. And so to that idea of trying to find clients who have the ability to repay, who have like a, sure income stream, do you work with nonprofits who provide financial coaching, who have those types of risk mitigation strategies embedded within their services? Because they come across several clients who could probably benefit from Lendstreet. And I'm saying that because Unidos US has a program right now where we're trying to connect our communities to lenders such as yourself through our nonprofits.
We'll certainly talk after this. It is the nonprofit sector. So we've started having conversations with the credit counseling, groups and some other nonprofit groups that are touching these consumers and that we think can benefit from our product. We think that's a strong channel, largely because these are consumers who are taking the step and self-identifying and looking for a solution. And those are typically what the types of clients we look for.
Unlikely partnerships spawning right here. Very exciting. Please.
I probably don't need a microphone at all.
Just for our live streamed listeners, just if you can hold on 1 second.
They can hear you. But to the young lady, I'm kind of directing this to the young lady in red. I'm terrible with names. Please don't be offended. But also to everyone else through your research, have you seen that employee attendance was positively impacted after these programs went forward? And even in your research to the other folks on the panel, are there numbers that kind of stood out that prove that when these kinds of things are happening, it creates stability, especially in the attendance practices of employees?
Well, I can't necessarily speak to attendance, but I do know from an engagement standpoint. So when we ask the question, are you more likely to recommend the city of Memphis as an employer of choice? Do you consider yourself to be valued by the organization? Those scores for people participating in our programs is much higher than people who aren't. So we know from that standpoint that it is working and it is providing a clear indicator to our employees that we care about them and that we understand what's going on with them.
And some evaluation is coming. Sorry, I was going to ask, is there a next phase of some evaluation of the program, right? So there will be some analysis of
Absolutely. So to your point, we're now in let's say month 17 with the program. So it's relatively short, but one of the things that we do is we have an annual engagement survey that we've been doing with employees. And so for 2019, when we administer that survey, we'll be able to get a little bit more data. But so far, just in general, from what we've seen and the data we have so far, it is making a difference.
So the overall climate, you can...
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The one thing that I would add to that I think is especially exciting about student loan repayment benefits is $50 a month adds up to so much in interest over the lifetime of that loan.
So actually to that point, so 17 months in the program, $50 a month, and you'll see on the sheet we've already saved our employees over $500,000.
And so people don't have to understand compound interest to understand that is a benefit to them over time.
Yeah.
One in the back there.
Hi, my name is Sebastian with the Arnold Foundation, and this is a question for Anne. You addressed this a little bit by saying that when the amount of outstanding debt went down, revenue went up. But one of the things that often comes up in conversations around eliminating criminal justice fines and fees is how do we find ways to replace lost revenue? So could you talk about some of the ways that the city grappled with that question and what might be lessons learned for other jurisdictions who want to do that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So we eliminated 10 local fees, and we were able to eliminate the ones that were locally authorized and the revenue came to the city and county. Some of those were bringing in so little revenue that we weren't even budgeting for the revenue that was coming in. For the biggest one, again, I think I said the collection rate on the largest fee, the monthly probation fee, was only 9%, but that still brought in about that and some other fees, the net cost to the county was $1 million that we just believed, and that was funding some reentry services, that we should fund those services in a more sustainable and just way. So that was really our mayor's budget office made that decision. And when we looked at it again on balance of that, costing $1 million, but lifting $32 million in debt off of families, many of which was very old and showed really, very little chance of that revenue coming in. I know that Alameda County, their Board of Supervisors is going to be considering this, that's Oakland, right across the bay from us. They're going to be considering very similar legislation on Tuesday of next week. And I know in a paper that some of the advocates put out, they showed that, again, the county is losing money. It looks like they are spending more to collect on these fees than they're bringing in. And, thousands of families are devastated. And again, that math just doesn't add up for anyone.
I think we have time for one more.
I live in Oakland. I hope it does.
Oh, okay.
Maybe one more question right here in the blue sweater.
Hi, my name is Romy Parzik. I work for Vault. We're a tech company based out of Austin, Texas that does the type of programs that Alex put in place in her city. And my question is for you, Alex. Well, first of all, congratulations, because across the board, there's only about 4% of employers that do this right now. It's really cutting edge. So you're really at the sort of, you're leading the forefront in this kind of initiative. I wanted to understand how your personal view changed and maybe the leadership of your city changed when you actually had access to look at the debt load that your employees have. I'm sure, like you said, you just really didn't expect it, and you didn't expect it across the age bands. So how has that changed the way you think about your employees and their needs?
Absolutely. So it changed our perspective tremendously because, going into it, as I mentioned before, we anticipated that, for example, our city attorney's office would have a high amount of debt. Our finance office, the areas that require professional degrees and certifications would be the places that we would see high utilization of the program. And so to come into it and realize that over 50% of our participants are in police and fire absolutely blew our minds. We had no clue. And then the fact that, once again, we thought it was going to be, people in their 20s and 30s, and then to find out that the average age is 41, and we have people in their 60s that are carrying student loan debt of large proportion, completely transformed the way that we looked at it. So as I mentioned before, it really has forced us to deal with financial literacy and financial wellness in a very concrete way, because we know that the burden of debt is really tremendous for our employees, and it impacts everything. It impacts their ability to save for retirement, to buy a home, their mental and mental health support and wellness as well. And so for us, this is a holistic issue, and we have to address it holistically. And so that's what we're doing. We have plans in place for pretty much everything I've mentioned.
Any other final last words from the panelists? If not, please join me in thanking them for a very enlightening conversation. And I'd like to ask Genevieve Melford to wrap this up. Do you want us to stay here, or should we? Maybe we'll just stay here.
I'll be quick to close this out, so please do. Yeah, thank you. So first, I just really want to thank today's wonderful speakers. I feel like you got a taste of how fortunate we are to get to engage with these folks over 18 months, and I'm glad that they got to really share their wisdom with all of you today. And I would really also like to acknowledge and thank the work of the Financial Security Program and the EPIC team for all their tremendous work. Today's event and the paper released today really represents many months of hard work by the whole team. So I really want to thank them. And I hope that you all will check out the report online at aspenepic.org and use it to hopefully inform your own sense of what you and your organization can do to help solve this crisis. And I hope you'll stay engaged with us if there's ways that we can help you you in your effort. Today actually marks the launch of the third phase of an EPIC cycle. We start with scoping the issue, and the research primer that we published about consumer debt is actually over here. There's a few copies if anyone's interested. Phase 2 is development of the solutions framework, which we've released today. And phase 3 is really about accelerating out some of the solutions that you've heard about today and that are in the report. So I hope that you'll stay tuned throughout 2019 as we engage in a number of activities to help really support leaders in continuing to do great work on these issues. And please do stay in touch with us. So with that, I really thank you for being here and for hanging out with us online, and have a great afternoon.